It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, just me and a friend out in the middle of nowhere, camping under the stars, peaceful, remote, just what we needed to escape the noise. But that's not what happened. It started with a whistle. Quiet at first, almost like the wind, but then it repeated, and it wasn't the wind, it was something or someone out there deep in the woods, deliberately calling. It was so faint, yet so eerie, like it was meant for us to hear. We thought we were just imagining things until the footsteps began. Slow, heavy, circling us. We grabbed our flashlights and went to check it out. But when we turned around, there was nothing. Just the dark trees, standing still. But the whistling? It kept coming. Closer. And that's when I realized we weren't alone. I should have known we were in danger the moment we stepped foot there. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me, my best friend Sarah, and the wilderness. We had grown up hiking and camping together, so we were both more than capable of handling a few days out in nature. We chose a remote spot in a national park, far from any hiking trails or campsites, thinking it would be the perfect escape from the noise of our busy lives. We arrived just before sundown, the sky painted with shades of orange and purple. The area we picked was next to a small creek, with towering trees surrounding us on all sides. There was a certain tranquility to it. We quickly set up our tent, gathered firewood, and started cooking dinner. The fire crackled, and for a while we enjoyed the peace and quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. But then, around 9 p.m., things started to feel off. The sounds of the forest, which had been so peaceful, began to change. A low, almost musical whistling came from deep in the woods. I froze for a second, unsure if I had imagined it, but Sarah heard it too. It was faint at first, just a soft melody carried on the wind. I told myself it was just an animal, perhaps a bird or a wind-whipped branch making an odd noise. But then the whistling continued, and it didn't sound natural. It had a rhythm, like a person intentionally whistling. We both grew uneasy. Sarah tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably someone else camping nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to investigate, though we didn't get very far before the sound stopped altogether. We stood in the dark, scanning the forest with our flashlights, but there was no sign of anyone, just the trees, the creek, and the cold night air. Still, we weren't convinced. As we made our way back to the camp, the whistling started again, but this time it was louder. It was coming from behind us, from the direction of the creek. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, and it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just some strange forest sound. We sat down by the fire, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every few minutes we'd hear the whistling again, always from a different part of the forest, always too far away to pinpoint. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was doing it was circling us. By 11 p.m., Sarah and I were both on edge. The fire was starting to die down, and the wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan. The whistling seemed to be coming closer, but we couldn't see anything in the dark woods. It was like someone was playing a game with us. "I don't like this," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaky. "Neither do I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the unease settling in my chest. but maybe we're just overthinking it. We decided to stay up for a while longer, hoping the sounds would stop. We talked about our childhood camping trips, trying to distract ourselves. But the whistling continued, and it became more erratic, almost mocking. Every time we tried to speak, it would stop, and then start again, always with that eerie melody. Around midnight, we heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not the scurrying of an animal, but deliberate steps, heavy and slow, as if someone was walking toward us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I motioned for Sarah to stay quiet. We both stood still, listening. The footsteps got closer, and then they stopped abruptly. There was a long pause before we heard another whistle, closer this time, almost directly behind us. I grabbed the flashlight and spun around, my hand shaking as I searched the darkness. There was nothing there. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's out there?" We didn't speak for a long time after that. We both stared at the fire, too afraid to move, too afraid to acknowledge what was happening. It was like the forest itself was alive, playing with us. Every few minutes we would hear the whistle again, followed by the sound of footsteps, closer, then farther away, like someone was pacing around our camp. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we were both exhausted and on edge. Neither of us had slept, and neither of us was willing to stay another minute. We packed up our gear in silence, too terrified to speak about what had happened. As we hiked back to the car, we glanced nervously over our shoulders, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. We didn't go camping together for months after that, and even now I can't shake the sound of that whistling. Every time I hear someone whistle, no matter where I am, I remember the eerie tune that circled our campsite in the dark. I never went back to that park, and I don't think I ever will. My best friend Jake and I were looking for a weekend getaway, something remote and peaceful, just two guys escaping the hustle of daily life. We'd been talking about this trip for weeks, choosing a spot deep in the mountains, miles away from civilization. The kind of place you only find if you're willing to leave behind the comforts of the world and rough it a bit. We weren't new to camping, but this particular spot felt special, untouched. We arrived at the trailhead just before sunset, the evening sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The forest around us was dense, almost claustrophobic, with towering pines and thick underbrush. We didn't think much of it at the time, just a few old trees and the occasional squirrel darting past. We'd brought enough gear to last the weekend, and the creek that ran nearby gave the place a sense of tranquility we hadn't felt in a while. We set up camp, built a fire, and roasted some hot dogs as the last light of the day faded away. The warmth of the flames and the cool mountain air made it feel like everything was in its right place. There was something magical about it. No cell phones, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. After dinner, we sat by the fire, telling stories, laughing like we used to when we were kids. It felt like we had all the time in the world. But as the night deepened, that calmness began to shift. I first noticed it when I looked up at the tree line. There, just past the edge of the firelight, was a figure. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree, or some weird formation of shadows. But then I realized it was standing upright, too still to be just part of the forest. The silhouette was tall, too tall to be any animal, and it had the unmistakable outline of a person. I pointed it out to Jake, but he just laughed it off. "Probably another camper," he said, his voice casual. "People do hike through here sometimes." I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about it, the way it stood motionless, not moving an inch. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a stump or a large rock casting a strange shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. We didn't say much for a while, the fire crackling between us as we both kept our eyes on that figure. It didn't move, it didn't blink, it just stood there, a dark shape against the forest. After a few minutes, I got up the nerve to call out, "Hey, is someone out there?" No response. "Hello?" I called again, this time louder, hoping for an answer. Still nothing. My heart began to race. There was no movement, no sound, nothing that indicated there was anyone out there. And that was the first thing that really got to me. How utterly silent everything was. No response, no rustling of leaves, nothing. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to give away what this figure really was. But it didn't move. Jake had noticed by now, and he stood up too, still laughing nervously. "It's probably just some guy like us, setting up camp. It's fine." But when we both took a step forward, the figure remained completely still. It wasn't just standing there, it was positioned almost perfectly, as if waiting for us to notice it. It was too deliberate to be some lost hiker or random wanderer. "Let's check it out," I said, my voice more uncertain than I wanted it to be. Jake didn't respond at first, but after a beat, he grabbed a flashlight and we both walked toward the figure. The night air grew colder as we moved away from the warmth of the fire. The closer we got, the less I could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The figure hadn't moved, not even a fraction. It just stood there, exactly where we'd seen it, in the shadows of the trees. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one around, just trees, rocks, and the cold, still air. We reached the spot where it had been standing, but there was no one, nothing at all. I glanced around in disbelief. Where the hell did it go? Jake was silent for a moment, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice suddenly low. "But that's weird." We both stood there, staring into the woods, a sense of unease settling over us. The figure had vanished, like it had never been there at all. There was no sign of movement, no sound, no trace. It was as if it had just melted into the forest. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "Probably just someone messing with us," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. Jake agreed reluctantly, but there was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before. The playful mood from earlier was gone, replaced by something else, something neither of us could shake. We returned to the campfire, but the night didn't feel the same. The silence around us seemed heavier now, more oppressive. The shadows were darker, the trees too still, as if they were holding their breath. The figure didn't return, but its absence felt worse than its presence. We stayed up for a while longer, but neither of us could sleep. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind made us jump. The fire burned low, and every time I looked into the woods, I half expected to see the figure standing just beyond the light, watching us once more. The next morning we packed up quickly and left, not saying much as we hiked back to the car. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting to see something, anything that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been in that spot at all. We never went back to that part of the mountains again. We didn't even talk about it much after we left. It was like we both knew something had happened there that neither of us could explain, and that maybe it was better that way. I still don't know what we saw, but I know one thing. There was something in those woods that night. something that didn't want us there, and whatever it was, I don't think it ever left. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip, a weekend away at a remote lake, surrounded by nothing but nature. My brother Tim and I had planned this for months. We wanted peace, quiet, and a break from our busy lives. The place we picked was off the beaten path, a small, secluded lake in the middle of a national forest, miles from any other campsite or trail. We knew it would be isolated, but that's exactly what we wanted. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and clean, like pine needles and damp earth. We were the only ones there, the only sound the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. After setting up our tent and gathering firewood, we spent a peaceful evening by the shore, watching the orange-pink hues of the sunset reflect off the still water. By nightfall, the temperature dropped and we huddled around the campfire, the warmth of the flames a welcome relief from the chill in the air. We talked about old memories, the adventures we'd had growing up, and how good it felt to get away from everything for a while. The sound of the crackling fire filled the silence, and the only other noise was the occasional splash from fish jumping in the lake. But then, as the fire burned low and the stars began to appear in the sky, the atmosphere shifted. We both heard it at the same time, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. I'd heard those sounds before. This was deeper, almost like a rumble vibrating through the ground. My brother, who was always the calm one, went still and quiet. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing, and I had no idea what it was. We sat in silence for a moment, straining to hear. But there was no mistaking it. The growl came again, this time louder and closer. It didn't sound like an animal I recognized. It wasn't the typical growl of a bear or a mountain lion. It was darker, more menacing, like something far larger and more dangerous than anything we had imagined. I stood up slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The fire flickered, casting long shadows in every direction. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, shining it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I saw nothing, just the quiet stillness of the night. "Maybe it's a bear," I suggested, my voice shaky despite myself. "We should head into the tent for the night." Tim nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He was scanning the tree line, his eyes darting between the shadows as if expecting something to emerge. We quickly packed up the fire and retreated to the tent, both of us trying to shake the growing unease that clung to the air. The growl hadn't sounded like any bear I'd ever heard, and as we zipped up the tent, I realized how utterly isolated we were. There was no one else around, no other campers, no one to help if something went wrong. We tried to settle down, but neither of us could sleep. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and every sound from outside the tent made my heart race. The wind in the trees sounded louder than usual, and the night felt oppressive, as though something was waiting for us just outside. Then, around 2 a.m., it happened again. The growl, this time closer, deeper, it rattled the ground beneath us. I froze, unable to breathe. It was like the creature, whatever it was pacing around the perimeter of our camp. I could hear heavy steps, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I had ever heard. This was something different. Tim and I stayed absolutely still, not daring to make a sound. The growl continued, now accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the brush, circling our campsite. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and I fought the urge to run. "I'm going to check it out," Tim whispered, his voice tight with fear. "No," I hissed. "Stay in the tent. Don't move." But Tim was already unzipping the tent, his flashlight in hand. I tried to grab his arm, but he pulled away. "Stay here," he said again, more firmly this time. Before I could argue, he was gone, slipping into the dark woods. My mind raced as I lay there, terrified of what was out there. What if it wasn't a bear? What if it was something worse? I strained to hear, my breath catching in my throat as every rustle and crackle from the trees sent my heart into overdrive. Then a scream, short, sharp, and filled with terror, pierced the air. I jumped up, heart in my throat. Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight and ran toward the sound of Tim's voice, calling out his name, but my voice was swallowed by the night. The flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. The woods felt alive with movement, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, watching me. I found Tim a few minutes later, stumbling back toward the campsite, wide-eyed and disoriented. His clothes were torn and his face was pale, covered in dirt and scratches. "What happened? Are you okay?" I asked, rushing toward him. He didn't answer at first, just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the camp. Finally, he muttered, "There's something out there. It's not a bear, not anything like that." "What do you mean?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. I went out there. I heard it. I thought I saw something huge, something not human. It moved too fast. It was like it was toying with me." We didn't stay another minute. We packed up in a frantic hurry, not caring about the mess we left behind, and hiked back to the car as quickly as we could. The woods felt colder now, darker, and I swear I heard something moving behind us the whole way out. But when we made it to the car, we didn't look back. We just drove straight home, no words exchanged. To this day, neither of us talks about it. Whatever we heard that night, whatever we saw, remains a mystery. I still wonder what it was that growled at us from the darkness and why it was so determined to make us leave. But I'm not sure I want to know. Some things, I think, are better left unanswered. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys a deep dive into nature, being surrounded by towering trees and the sound of running water, feeling far removed from the modern world. I loved the idea of camping in a secluded spot, somewhere no one else would think to venture. So when my cousin Ryan suggested we take a weekend trip to a hidden valley deep in the woods, I was all in. We'd been camping together for years, but this time felt different. This spot was entirely off the grid, no marked trail, no regular campsite, just raw nature. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to slip behind the mountains. The sky was a perfect canvas of pinks and oranges, and the air was fresh with that crisp, earthy scent that only comes when you're far away from civilization. The valley we camped in was nestled between two ridges, surrounded by dense forest. There was a small creek nearby, its water trickling over rocks and creating a soothing backdrop of sound. The peace was almost overwhelming. Setting up camp was easy, and once the tent was in place, we started gathering firewood. As we stacked logs and prepped dinner, I felt a contentment that only comes when you know you're completely disconnected from the chaos of daily life. We grilled some steaks over the open flame, laughing and chatting like we used to when we were younger. The simplicity of it all, just the fire, the food, the company, felt like everything was in its rightful place. But as the sun dipped lower and the forest grew darker, a strange tension settled in. It wasn't like a sense of danger, not at first, more like the forest itself was waiting for something, like it was holding its breath. The shadows between the trees grew longer, stretching across the forest floor, and with each passing minute, the silence felt less peaceful and more heavy. We finished dinner and sat near the fire, the warmth of the flames flickering against the cool air. The crackling of the fire was the only sound until, out of nowhere, I heard something in the distance. It was a soft rustling, the kind of sound a deer or a small animal might make. I wasn't worried, but I instinctively glanced toward the tree line just beyond the campfire's glow. It was hard to see anything in the thick darkness past the light, but my eyes lingered, trying to make sense of the movement. Ryan must have noticed me looking because he followed my gaze. I could see his face tighten, his expression turning serious. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. I turned my head back toward the trees, focusing harder now. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe a shadow playing weird tricks in the flickering fire. But no, there were two glowing dots, like eyes, shining out from the blackness. I froze. The first thing I thought was that it was a deer. Sometimes their eyes can catch the light in strange ways. But there was something off about it. The eyes were too high up, off the ground, to be a typical animal. And they didn't blink, they didn't move, they just stared. And the more I looked, the more I felt like those eyes weren't just noticing us, they were watching us. Ryan's voice broke the silence. "Dude, are you seeing this?" "Yeah," I whispered back, my throat suddenly dry. "I'm seeing it." We both stood up slowly, keeping our eyes on those dots, not wanting to take our gaze away from them. I grabbed the flashlight from our gear and shined it in the direction of the eyes, but the beam didn't reach far enough. The darkness beyond the firelight swallowed the light, and the eyes were still there, glowing faintly. I don't know why, but I started to feel uneasy. My heart was picking up speed in my chest, and the air around us suddenly felt colder. The peacefulness of the creek and the crackling fire now seemed far away. The woods seemed more oppressive, like they were closing in on us. "What do you think it is, Well?" I asked Ryan, though I already had a bad feeling. "I don't know, man," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe a bear?" "No way," I said, shaking my head. "Bears don't act like this." We both stood there, watching the eyes, but they never moved. It was like they were locked in place, fixed on us, watching us with a disturbing patience. My skin prickled with an unsettling feeling, and I took a step back. "We should head to the tent," I said, my voice shaking a little. The silence that followed only made the tension worse. Ryan nodded without saying a word, but neither of us made a move. Then, as if something snapped, the eyes blinked. Once. Then they disappeared. Just like that. There was no movement after that, no rustling of leaves, no animals darting off. The eyes were simply gone. "What the hell was that?" Ryan asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I muttered, my mind racing. "Let's get inside the tent. I don't feel right about this." We rushed to the tent, not saying much, but the unease lingered like a thick fog between us. Inside, we zipped it up quickly, and for a few minutes we just sat there, listening to the quiet around us. The only sound was the faint gurgling of the creek. My heart was still racing. "I don't like this," Ryan said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Something's out there." I nodded, not knowing what to say. We both sat in the dark, staring at the walls of the tent, too scared to sleep. Every creak and crackle outside made us jump, our ears straining for any sign of movement. Every gust of wind felt like something brushing past the tent. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something. A rustling in the trees, a low thud, like something large was moving nearby. "Ryan," I whispered, "did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. Yeah, it's close. We sat in silence, listening. Then we heard it again. A low thump, followed by a faint scratching sound, like something was dragging itself through the brush. It was getting closer. I slowly unzipped the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. The air outside was colder now, sharper. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but all I could see were trees and shadows. And then I saw it. A dark shape moved in the corner of the flashlight's beam, too large to be a normal animal and too low to the ground to be human. It wasn't moving fast, but it was deliberate, like it was circling us, drawing closer. I had no time to react. I grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him back into the tent, and zipped it shut. We stayed up the rest of the night, our backs pressed against the walls of the tent, listening for any sign of movement. But nothing came. By morning, the eerie feeling hadn't left. We packed up quickly and left, the weight of the previous night's events hanging over us like a dark cloud. Neither of us spoke much as we hiked back to the car, but we both knew. Whatever we'd encountered out there was not something we could explain. I still don't know what it was, but every time I think back to that night, I feel the hairs on my neck rise. We were never supposed to be there. And whatever was watching us from the dark, I don't think it was done with us. I'll never forget the trip I took with my best friend Ben to a remote campsite deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a last-minute decision, one of those let's get away from everything kind of plans. The world had been feeling increasingly chaotic, and we needed a break, just a weekend to unplug and reset. Little did I know this trip would become the most unsettling experience of my life. We found a little-known spot along an old logging trail, a secluded area by a stream. It was the kind of place that required a long hike to get to, which was perfect because it meant we'd have total privacy. The weather was beautiful. The sun shining through a canopy of trees, the birds chirping. It felt like the perfect escape. The place was peaceful, isolated, just the way we wanted it. The first day went without incident. We set up camp, built a fire, cooked some food, and hiked around the area, taking in the natural beauty. The stream was crystal clear, the water cold and refreshing, and the forest around us was still and quiet, as if it was untouched by time. At night, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about old memories. We heard the occasional rustle in the woods, but nothing that made us feel unsafe. But as night deepened, something about the place began to feel off. The sounds of the forest seemed to change. The wind, which had been gentle earlier, picked up, making the trees groan and sway. The fire's glow flickered strangely, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground. We joked about how the place was starting to feel like the set of a horror movie, but there was an edge to our laughter, a nervousness that wasn't there before. Around midnight, I went into the tent to grab something, and when I came back out, I noticed Ben was staring into the dark woods, his face pale. His eyes were wide, fixed on something just beyond the tree line. "Ben!" I called out, stepping toward him. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a strained voice, he muttered, "Do you see that?" I turned my head, trying to follow his gaze, but at first I saw nothing. The trees were too thick, the darkness too deep. But then I saw something moving between the trunks. Something that shouldn't have been there. A dark figure, too large to be a deer, but too vague to make out any details. "Maybe it's a bear," I suggested, trying to rationalize it. Or a person, could be another camper. Ben shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No, this thing isn't moving like anything I've ever seen. It's like it's watching us. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I tried to peer into the dark, but all I could make out were the flickering shadows of the trees, and then, as if to confirm our fear, I saw it again, a dark shape, moving between the trees. It was quick, but unnaturally so, as if it was more than just a shadow. It didn't seem to belong to the forest. "Let's go in the tent," Ben said urgently, his voice trembling now. I agreed, and we quickly scrambled inside, zipping the flap shut. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked in protest. We sat in the dark, not speaking, listening intently for any sound from outside. The forest was unusually quiet now. No crickets, no rustling animals, no sound of wind through the leaves. Just that heavy silence, like the woods were holding their breath. We didn't dare to sleep. The only light we had was the faint glow of our campfire, which we could barely see through the thin fabric of the tent. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on us, the air thick with a sense of unease. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap, followed by the faintest rustle of leaves. It sounded like something was moving just outside, circling our camp, watching. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, a bear, a deer, maybe even a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too deliberate, too calculated. Whatever was out there was not like anything I'd ever encountered before. It wasn't just a predator, it was something else. The hours dragged on and the tension in the air grew unbearable. Every little sound seemed to trigger our fears. Every shift of the tent fabric made our hearts race. Around 3 a.m. the strangest thing happened. We both heard it at the same time. A low, guttural growl, so deep and resonant that it vibrated in my chest. It came from somewhere outside the tent, close enough that I could feel it, but distant enough that I couldn't pinpoint its location. Ben's eyes widened, and I saw his hand trembling as he pointed toward the tent flap. "It's right outside," he whispered. I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed out there, just beyond our reach, watching us. I turned toward the flap, straining to see any sign of movement. And then, through the thin fabric, I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, staring at us from the darkness. The eyes were not animal eyes. They were too large, too intelligent. They glowed with a pale, unnatural light. And for a long moment, they didn't blink, didn't move. They just watched. I held my breath, too afraid to make a sound. I could hear Ben breathing heavily beside me, his body rigid with fear. Then, without warning, the eyes disappeared, vanishing into the dark as if they'd never been there at all. We stayed frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to speak. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to believe it was just our imagination playing tricks on us, but something in my gut told me that was not the case. I knew then that we were not alone. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in those woods, something that was hunting us. Ben finally broke the silence. "We have to leave, now." We didn't pack up our things, we didn't gather our equipment, we didn't even bother to put out the fire. We grabbed our bags, zipped up the tent, and made a run for it, hightailing it down the trail as fast as we could. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees made us flinch, but we didn't stop. We didn't look back. By the time we reached the car, we were both out of breath, our hearts racing with adrenaline and fear. We didn't talk much on the drive home. We didn't need to. The look on Ben's face said it all. Neither of us had ever been so afraid in our lives. I've been camping plenty of times since that night, but I'll never forget what we saw or what we didn't see in those woods. I don't know what it was that stalked us that night. All I know is that there was something out there, something watching, and we were lucky to get away. To this day, I never camp alone, and I never go back to those woods. There are moments in life when everything seems perfect. You think you're just taking a simple camping trip, far enough from civilization to escape the noise of daily life, but close enough to nature that the stars are bright and the air is crisp. I had one of those moments with my girlfriend Julia when we decided to head out to a remote campsite in the Pacific Northwest. We had been working long hours, and this trip was supposed to be our reset, a chance to reconnect and recharge. The campsite was nestled deep in the forest, miles from any main road. We had to take a rough, winding trail to get there, which meant that no one would be wandering by. Perfect, we thought. No distractions, no interruptions. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the golden light of the sun began to filter through the thick canopy above. The forest around us was so dense it felt like stepping into a different world, one where the outside had no place and nature had complete control. Julia was excited, and I could tell she was happy to be away from the office and the stress of our everyday routines. We set up the tent near a small stream that wound through the pines. The sound of water babbling over rocks added a soothing soundtrack to the otherwise quiet woods. That night, we cooked over the campfire, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything and nothing. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of nature, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Everything felt calm, serene. But as darkness descended, something felt a little off. It wasn't enough to make me anxious, but it made me aware. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. The forest felt denser in the dark, and the shadows seemed deeper. After a while, we crawled into the tent, exhausted but content. The fire outside crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls of the tent. I lay there, listening to the wind moving through the tall pines, and soon fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, a low, almost inaudible whisper. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush, but as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't either of those things. The sound was different. It was a voice, a faint, indistinct whisper coming from somewhere outside the tent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or a trick of my half-asleep mind. Julia stirred beside me, and I saw her silhouette shift in the dim light. She mumbled something in her sleep and then fell quiet again. But the whispers didn't stop. They continued, faint, like distant voices calling out to each other. At first they seemed random, like a conversation I couldn't quite make out. Then they became more deliberate, as if they were moving around the tent, circling it. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I could feel my heart rate start to pick up. I turned to Julia, my voice barely a whisper as I said her name. "Julia, did you hear that?" She didn't respond. Her breathing was slow and steady, the rhythmic sound of her sleep only amplifying the eerie quiet of the night. The whispers were now unmistakable. They were coming from the trees, from the pines that loomed just beyond our campsite. The voices seemed to swirl, overlapping, like murmurs from a group of people having a conversation in a language I didn't understand. It was unnerving. I sat up, pulling the zipper open slightly, trying to peek out into the dark woods. But all I saw was blackness, the light from our campfire barely visible through the fabric of the tent. The whispers were louder now, almost like they were just outside the flap. My pulse quickened. "Julia," I whispered, shaking her slightly. "Wake up." She stirred, but didn't open her eyes. "What is it?" she mumbled groggily. "Do you hear that? The voices?" She blinked and sat up, her eyes wide. "What voices?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. I pulled open the tent zipper fully and stepped outside, cautiously scanning the dark woods around us. The wind had picked up, but there was no one there, just trees and shadows. The whispers had stopped as soon as I'd stepped outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Maybe it's just some animals," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my voice didn't convince even myself. Julia, still inside the tent, called out to me, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Are you sure we're alone out here?" Her question made me pause. I hadn't thought about it like that before. We were far away from any main trail. No other campers were nearby. Or so I thought. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure. A shadow standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible, but distinct enough to make out the outline of a person, or something that looked human. My blood ran cold. "Julia!" I yelled, my voice panicked now. Get out here! There's someone out there!" I stumbled back to the tent, zipping it up quickly. Julia was already standing, her face pale in the dim light of the lantern. "What is it? Who's out there?" "I saw someone," I said, breathless. "They were standing just beyond the trees. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was like they were waiting for us." Julia grabbed the flashlight, her hands shaking as she turned it on. We both peeked out into the woods, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest stood still, its secrets hidden in the shadows. "Maybe it was just a deer," I suggested weakly. But even I could hear the doubt in my voice. The night passed uneventfully after that, but neither of us slept. The whispers had stopped, but the tension in the air remained. The next morning we packed up and left without a word, the strange feeling of being watched lingering long after we'd left the campsite. Even now I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a figment of my imagination, a trick of the wind, or something more sinister? All I know is that whatever it was, I never want to experience it again. There are some places that feel wrong the moment you step into them, and now whenever I think back to those pines, I feel a shiver run down my spine. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, disconnected from the world, surrounded by nature. A few months ago, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to a remote location I'd heard about from a friend. The spot was tucked away deep in the wilderness, an old campsite by a small lake, far from any hiking trails or busy campgrounds. It seemed like the perfect escape. What I didn't know was that it would become a nightmare I'd never forget. The day I arrived, the weather was perfect. The sun was high, the air was warm but not too hot, and the forest around me seemed untouched by time. I hiked to the campsite with my gear, setting up by the lake, the water shimmering in the sun. It felt like a paradise, a serene, peaceful spot that I couldn't wait to enjoy. I spent the afternoon hiking around the area, enjoying the quiet solitude and taking in the breathtaking views. The only sounds I heard were the birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. By evening, I had the whole campsite to myself. I started a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled into my camp chair by the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon. But when darkness fell, the mood of the forest shifted. The sounds of nature that had seemed so comforting earlier turned into something more unsettling. The wind through the trees was now a low, haunting whistle. The occasional splash of water from fish jumping in the lake felt like something moving closer to me in the dark. I shrugged it off, blaming the isolation and my growing sense of being alone. I decided to go to bed early, hoping to get a good night's rest. I zipped myself into the tent, settled in, and tried to sleep. The world outside was quiet now, the kind of deep silence you only find in the wilderness. Just as I started to drift off, I heard something. A faint noise. It was the sound of footsteps, light and slow, coming from the edge of the campsite. I froze. I knew I was alone. I'd seen no one all day, and there was no trail leading to the site. My heart started to race. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was only silence. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, passing by. Trying to shake off the unease, I closed my eyes again, determined to sleep. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, stepping around the edge of my tent. I jumped up, my heart thumping in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, shining the beam into the surrounding darkness. The light danced over the trees, the ground, the lake. Nothing. No one was there. Confused and scared, I stepped outside, scanning the woods around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a strange stillness to the air now. No wind, no animal sounds. Just the eerie quiet of the night. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense that something was out there, watching me, only grew stronger. I didn't want to believe it, but the fear inside me was starting to grow. I convinced myself it was just nerves. Maybe it was the wind or some animal moving around in the underbrush, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. I spent the next hour walking around the campsite, checking the area with my flashlight. Everything seemed normal, too normal, like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind and returned to the tent, attempting to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like the eyes of the forest were fixed on me, waiting for the right moment. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. This time the sound was different. It wasn't just footsteps, it was a distinct, heavy breathing, like someone was standing just outside the tent, close enough to hear. I could feel my pulse quicken as I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. The breathing was slow, deliberate, in and out, as if someone was waiting for me to do something. I stayed completely still, listening to the sound for what felt like forever. Finally, the breathing stopped, and I heard a soft, raspy voice, just a whisper, coming from outside. "Come out." I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice was clear, but it wasn't human. It was distorted, like a whisper from somewhere far away, yet right there at the edge of the tent. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, my mind racing for an explanation. But there was no logical explanation. The voice wasn't someone else at the campsite. It wasn't a prank. It was something else. I stayed in that tent, paralyzed by fear, for what felt like hours. The silence was broken only by my erratic breathing and the occasional rustle outside. I couldn't tell if the voice was still there. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent again to check. I just huddled in the corner, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the night to end. By morning, I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe it was the isolation, the strange sounds of the forest, the lack of sleep. It all played tricks on my mind. But when I stepped outside, the ground around my campsite was disturbed. The dirt was scuffed and marked with large footprints, as if someone, or something, had been circling the tent. The prints were too large to be human, and too irregular to be any animal I knew. And the oddest thing, they didn't lead anywhere. There was no path away from the campsite. The prints just stopped. It was as if whatever had been out there had been right up against my tent and then simply vanished. I packed up as quickly as I could, terrified but too shaken to stay another minute. I couldn't bring myself to explain it to anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? As I walked back to the trailhead, I couldn't help but feel that something was still following me, just out of sight. The feeling lingered for days after I left that place. To this day, I've never been able to shake the memory of the voice, the heavy breathing, the unnerving presence that seemed to be just beyond my reach. And I've never gone camping alone again. Whatever was out there, it knew I was there, and it wanted me to come out. Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode.